Just to start off, I'm always a little struck when I'm introduced and I hear it said that my day job is a psychotherapist. Um, that's the way we've been referring to it probably for 30 years at the Zen Center when I'm introduced. I actually do it quite a bit at night. Um, but even probably more important, and I think it is actually important for this particular Dharma talk, in my sense, my being a psychotherapist and being a Zen teacher are not so separate. It's different faces really of the same thing. It's a different model. It has a different modality to it. But in my sense of things, both Zen teaching and psychotherapy are about liberation. And it's about freedom. And it's about uncovering our true self and manifesting that in the world. So that's the direction. And then as we talk about in Buddhism, there are skillful means of how we express that. Different people need different things. Different situations call for different things. And I think it's very helpful for us as Zen practitioners to remember that everything is one face of the infinite faces. From ancient China, they would talk about the 10,000 things. That's the infinite things. It's just the way it was discussed. So the one is the many is the one. Everything all combined is this one universe. Each thing, even this set of beads, is a manifestation, is a face of the one pure and clear thing. It's one particular face of a multitude of faces. So many that we just call them infinite. There's a place in the morning bell chant, we'll see if I get this right, but it says, all the names of the Buddha surpass all the sand of the Ganges. Each individual sand, what's it called? Piece. All together, all the sands of the Ganges still aren't as many as the faces of the Buddha. It's a very important point. And you'll see as I go forward, I'm going to use a couple of teaching tools to discuss this tonight. So I'm going to start out. This is a poem written by Zen Master Bon Soeng. Many of you have heard this before, some of you have not. To me, this expresses the heart and soul of Zen Master Bon Soeng's teaching. Although I have to say, as I've been working with this poem for speaking tonight, I realize that you'll see I'm going to finish with one more step as necessary. And I'll be talking about that too. So let me start with the poem, and I'll read it a couple of times so you can get it. It's called Original Face. Your true self is always shining and free. Human beings make something and enter the ocean of suffering. Only without thinking can you return to your true self. The high mountain is always blue, white clouds coming, going. Once again, Original Face, poem by Zen Master Bon Soeng. Your true self is always shining and free. Human beings make something and enter the ocean of suffering. Only without thinking can you return to your true self. The high mountain is always blue, light clouds coming, going. I'd actually like to start with the title, Original Face. Take that in, Original Face. If the Buddha has 10,000 faces and 10,000 names, what is the original face? What is the original name? If all of our faces on this screen right now are faces of the Buddha, or of Buddha nature, if that makes it a little less personal for you, what is that original face? Sometimes we work with a koan or kangan, which asks, what is your original face before your parents were born? Before the conditions and circumstances arose in this life to bring you into form. What is that original face? Who are you before your identity of Paul or John or Stephen or Karen or Laura or Jen? What are you? If you break down the story of self, what's left? There's a line in our temple rules that I want to bring in here. And I'll just preface it with the short poem that goes before it. It says, originally there is nothing. So what is your original face? Originally there is nothing. But Buddha practiced unmoving under the Bodhi tree for 6 years. And for 9 years, Bodhidharma sat silently in sorrow. Originally, there's nothing, but Buddha sat under a tree for 6 years. Bodhidharma sat silently in a cave for 9 years. Why did they do that? If originally there is nothing, and our original face is before the conditions of our lives arise, why sit for 6 years under a Bodhi tree? Or for 9 years in a cave? Why do that? Why is it that you come here and sit for half an hour? Many of you have sat long retreats. Why do that? That question helps open up your original face. And here's the line that I want to focus on or bring into the poem. If you can break the wall of yourself, you will become infinite in time and space. So I'm going to change it a little bit. If I were doing the translation, I would take out the pronouns. I think the pronouns distract us because the pronouns point to me and to you already after conditions and causes have arisen. So if you, I will leave the you in because the you is the problem. If you can break the walls of self, already infinite in time and space. So this poem, the first line of the poem says, your true self is always shining and free. That's the beginning point. That's who we are. Even when we're lost in the samsaric dream of our desires, our anger, and our ignorance. Your true self is always shining and free. True nature is only appearing. So remember, even our suffering is a face of true nature. Nothing is left out. We don't attain our true self when we get rid of our suffering. That's in our minds, that's what we're doing in practice. We're practicing so we get rid of the shit that we don't like. So then we're like Buddha, free and clear. I'd like to say, without a complete assurance, but I'd like to say that's mythology. There are moments when we're free from our suffering. You all know this moment. Zen Master Bon Soeng used to say, enlightenment is easy to get, hard to keep. Because attaining our true self, becoming our original nature, is a moment-to-moment experience. It's our thinking mind that ties it all together into a self. Just now, just now, just now, just now. We appear, and just now we disappear. In the realm of true self, in original face, there is no life. There is no death. Jeff was born on a particular date. Jeff will die on a particular date. But Jeff is a creation. This universe is constantly bubbling. Bubbles come and go. But the liquid that the bubbles are part of remain. So Jeff is born and Jeff will die. But Jeff arises and disappears moment to moment. And before thinking, where is Jeff? I could say that talking about myself, but I can also say that talking about all of you. Before thinking, where does Zen Master Bon Soeng come from? And who is this Zen Master, this Jeff? We all have ideas about that. I have my ideas. Each one of you have your ideas. None of us in our ideas really know Jeff. You only know Jeff when you let go of your ideas and really listen, really hear. So your true self is always shining and free. Human beings make something and enter the ocean of suffering. It's a very, very important point. Human beings make something and enter the ocean of suffering. That's the point where Jeff arises. That's the point where thinking arises. Once we leave before thinking, and thinking arises, we make Jeff, we make Casey, we make Eileen, we make Sarah, we make Joe, we make John. And when we make these things, we create identities and ideas around them. Look around these squares. I think everybody who's on this call right now has been here before. So how many ideas do you have about Paul? What's your idea about James, Dennis, Juliana? What do you imagine? And how much do you believe what you think? If you're like me, you believe it. You think Jeff is this way. You've heard Zen Master Bon Soeng speak many times. You've heard Paul ask many questions. And out of those few bits of information, we create a story. That story is identity. That story is narrative. And then we believe that the narrative is the truth. But if you're anything like me, you realize that actually the narrative changes. And then we believe the new narrative, forgetting about the old narrative. But it can't be that a narrative holds all of the truth, or all of truth, because we don't know anything outside of the information that we have. So as a practitioner, that leads us back to not knowing, to before thinking. And that returning to before thinking brings us right back to true self. It's almost true self equals suffering mind. It's the same mind, just with a different narrative. There's a Paul Simon quote that I love. Some of you have heard it before. It says, first, there was an ocean. Now there's a mountain range. Everything is different, but nothing has changed. Everything is constantly in flux, but underneath, nothing is changing. This is the essence of our Zen practice. It's our narrative that we get stuck in. So when Zen Master Soeng would talk about making something, he said there are 4 kinds of making. Wanting, holding, attaching, and checking. I'm going to just briefly go through these 4. Wanting. Do you need a definition or do you already understand? We don't have something that we want. We grab for it. We're even willing to push somebody else out of the way so we can have what we want. Buddha said suffering arises out of desire. So in many ways, wanting is the primary point of desire. The second one is holding. You ever have an idea that you really believe in, and you start to get information to the contrary, but you reject the information because you want to hold on to your idea, your identity, who you believe you are, is actually something that you hold. We hold on to things that we want. We push away things that we don't want. Out of that action, suffering appears. Wanting, holding, attaching. My idea, my painting, my house. Attaching to ideas, beliefs, opinions, and again, narratives. My idea about the nature of the universe. In all these ways, there's protection happening. We'll get a little bit into that. And the last one, which is quite important, is checking. When Zen Master Soeng talked about checking, what he was talking about was self-doubt. You know how you do something, and then you come home, and you say, oh boy, I hope that was okay. What does Rob think about that talk? Oh my God, I must have humiliated myself. This always feeling that we're not quite enough, that somebody else has something more that makes us less than. And think about it a second. How does it feel to you when you feel less than? When you feel like somebody has power or knowledge over you? What do you do with that? See, each of these things is active. It's not just an idea. We actually live them out in our lives. And self-doubt and feeling there's something I should be, but it's something that I'm not, is insidious in the way it pervades our narrative and leaves us in the wheel of samsara and suffering. So that's a Buddhist slant on it. This is where I want to throw in a little bit of a psychotherapeutic view, or a view of how psychology plays its role here. And what I want to tie it to is another teaching line that Zen Master Soeng would use, where he would say, you have to understand your karma. You have to perceive how you operate in this world. If we aren't aware of the causes and conditions of our behaviors and feelings and our responses and defenses to all of that, we're actually trapped in a house of mirrors. and we can't find the doorway out. So pretty briefly, I just want to run down a psychological sense of what we can look at as understanding our karma. Each one of us is born into a family. That family is, well, let's say the moment that we're born is a very particular time and space construct. You're born into a particular location at a particular time in history. And that in and of itself begins to create the circumstances and conditions of your life. Some people are born into a rich family. Some people are born into a poor family. Some people are born Caucasian. Some people are born African American. Some people are born African English. Some people are born in China. Some people are born in America. Where you're born has a tremendous impact on the causes and conditions of your life. And then the particularity of where and to whom. Each of our parents are also struggling in this suffering world. So what circumstance did you get born into? Human beings are perhaps the only animal, or let's just put it this way, perhaps the most helpless animal at birth. I once saw a documentary on ducks. It's a wonderful documentary. It's called Duckumentary. I'd really encourage you to see it if you like that kind of thing. But the documentary begins with a wood duck being hatched. And the wood duck hatches, I don't know, the way they made it look, let's say 50 feet above the ground in a little crevice in a tree. And the very first thing that the mother does is push the wood duck out of the tree. So the first real experience of a wood duck's life is falling a tremendous amount of distance. Doesn't know anything. And there it is falling. And so these ducks fall from the tree and they land in the water and they shake themselves off and they start swimming. And then they start eating. They know everything they have to know. Human beings are born, we know nothing. We would be destroyed by that 50-foot fall. And we're completely dependent on the people who are our parents or our families or our community. And each of those families and communities have their own struggles. Think about your own birth. Where was your family when you were born? Were they having financial difficulties? Were they in a time of great stress? Pregnancy is a stress in and of itself. Being born, having a birth in the family, as wonderful as it is, creates so much stress. And your parents have to respond to that stress. And none of us are perfect. So all of us are struggling to manage the circumstances of our lives. And yet here's this little child, this little baby that needs everything given to them. So the baby has this amazing ability. Sometimes, once I heard it takes about 3 months for this to happen. In further research, it looks like it takes about 6 months until the child figures out how to manipulate the parent. Where the child figures out, if I do this, I get my need met. If I do this, maybe not so much. So I'm going to do this. And at this point, we're starting to create what sometimes we call a small self. Sometimes it's called a false self. Sometimes it's called an adapted self. but we have the ability to recognize our circumstances and create a self that we think is going to help us survive. And that self begins to develop. And it's since everything is happening simultaneously, there's so much going on that the self is continuing to change, continuing to adapt, and continuing to mold itself. But experientially, it seems to me that as that's going on, we're getting farther and farther and farther away from what this poem is calling our original self, or our original face, or our true self. We defend. We get lost into our defenses. And that causes incredible suffering. All the wanting, the holding, the checking, and the attaching happens within this dynamic process of trying to survive. And as brilliant as our techniques of survival are, they also force us to create a gap or a separation between this true self, this original face, and the narrative or the identity that we live out in this world. So we come to Buddhist practice to try to make sense of this mishmash of experience and narrative and thought and feeling that we see ourselves as ourself. So from a psychological point of view, we try to untangle the story, understand our karma in order to be able to become more free from that karma. From a Buddhist and Zen perspective, we're training to not attach to every thought and feelings as they arise. We're learning to witness the thoughts, to witness the feelings, and to not touch it. To just watch it come and watch it go. And as we can perceive that coming and going, we have to raise some doubt. Where did that thought arise from? And as it passed, where did it go? So we talked about this a month ago in the Dharma talk, we raise great doubt, not self-doubt. The antidote is not making myself higher and better, it's letting go and allowing great doubt to open the story up. What is this? If you look at it from a psychological point of view, what made me react so strongly there? How come I get so afraid whenever this particular thing happens? To begin to notice the patterns of our minds and of our hearts. That's psychological, and it's also practice. Understand your karma, not to make it go away, but so that you're not trapped behind the unconsciousness of your own behavior because you don't understand the causes and conditions, or you don't perceive the causes and conditions which are creating the suffering in your life. So I mistimed this talk. It's probably time I should open for questions, and I'm really only halfway through. So I want to go through the last couple of lines really quickly. So, because I think it's important just to finish out the poem. So he says, only without thinking can you return to your true self. In many ways, what I've been talking about understanding your karma, perceiving your narrative, understanding the arising of the conditions and your responses to those conditions, that allows you to let go of your thinking or your ideas or your attachments, your wanting, your holding, and your checking. When Zen Master Sung says, without thinking, what he really is meaning is without attaching to thinking. Don't read this or don't hear this to mean you're not supposed to think. Thinking and feeling are these amazing capacities that we as human beings have. The problem is we attach to them and we make something about them. So when he says only without thinking, without attaching to our thinking and feeling, we don't make the suffering that arises out of it. So we're free. And then he finishes very simply, the high mountain is always blue. White clouds coming, going. Truth is just like this. You know, in ancient China, there was a movement around the time of the beginning of Zen that was landscape painting and landscape poetry. And the reason the Zen practitioners gravitated in that way was it represented the majesty of the non-human world before thinking. Before thinking, the high mountain is just there. White clouds come and go. Nothing changes. Somebody once interpreted that last line, white clouds coming and going, as thinking. So if you look at it that way, our thinking and feeling comes and goes, but the blue mountain is never changing. Our thinkings and feelings come and go, but our true self is never touched. There's a story from Korea many years ago, a very famous Zen master named Wan Hyo. And apparently he hired 5 young men in his village to beat him up. And they pummeled him. And all the way through, he shouted out, "You still haven't touched me." He lay almost unconscious on the ground from the beating. And he said, "You still haven't touched me." So who is this me that they didn't touch? That's the purview of Zen. The creations of our minds are the walls of ourself. As we can break through the walls of ourself, we're already infinite in time and space. We get lost between the walls. And like I said, it's in a way like a house of mirrors. But like a dream, poof, you wake up. The high mountain is always blue. The full moon of enlightenment never stops shining. From our vantage point on Earth, we see the moon go through all its phases, from a new moon to a full moon and back to a new moon. That's our perspective. The way the light from the sun is interacting with the Earth and the moon. But the moon never changes. The position in relation to the Earth and sun is always changing. But the moon itself never changes. All of us are born into this world. We age, we exist, we act, and we die. Every living form has that same life cycle. And behind the facade, nothing is changing. Your true self is always shining and free. And that to experience that, to have a glimpse and a taste of that, is the hero's journey, which is Zen practice. Our practice is alive. Our practice matters because there's the potential to wake up and really help this world. That's our job as human beings. That's what gives our life meaning and purpose. If we get lost in our making, in our desires, in our holding, and our wanting, we so lose our own nature. And our practice offers us a possibility of a more porous self. Sometimes I use the image of a woven scarf. And if you pull the scarf this way, and you pull it this way, and you pull it this way in all the 10 directions, the waft and the weave open a little bit, and more light can come through. So another image of this is, as we practice, we're pulling at the self. At first, the walls are solid and tight. But as we work with them and open, the light of true self can come through. It's what you already are. Even in all of our suffering and all of our ignorance and all of our desire, it's just a manifestation of the true nature and the original face of this world. You are the universe. And each time, each moment appears is the universe expressing itself through you. I'll end on an old Grateful Dead line that says, the line goes, "You are the eyes of the universe." Each one of us are the eyes of the universe. And each one of us makes the universe alive right now. And the question I'll leave you with is, what kind of universe will you make?